This paper is joint with Alan Auerbach and Daryl Kohler, who's a chief engineer, computation engineer in my software company. And so I've been running this software company for about 23 years. It's called Economic Security Planning, and we make personal financial planning software. And it kind of does what Bob Willis was saying we need, which is having a tool that will figure out how to give people the highest living standard through their retirements, to make decisions for them really about when to take the retirement money, whether to take the Roth money first, to also optimize over Social Security, to optimize over annuitization. So we now have a new tool called Maxify Planner, which is freely available to any of you. If any of you guys would like to have a copy for free, just let me know, just shoot me an email. But it does this stuff, especially you older people. Bob, you're gonna get a free copy, because it really will make you money. Just like John's and his colleagues were saying, there's a huge amount of money being left on the floor because people are not doing this optimization. A lot of it is coming from Social Security and the interaction with when to take the annuities. And you can also kind of control the degree to which you're going to, taking most advantage in terms of trying to raise your present value lifetime spending might require you spending very little for a while and then a whole lot later after you annuitize at 80. But that reduction, that differential in living standards is not something people may want, so you can control that. So you can optimize subject to how much of a cut you're willing to take now to have a higher living standard later. But anyway, let's see how we get this thing going. I think we go that way. Okay, so making work pay for the elderly. Well, so I'm working on this with Alan and Daryl through a grant that the Sloan Foundation gave us. So we're very grateful to the Sloan Foundation for their support. Older Americans face a plethora of work disincentives. I mean, here's the list. I'm sure I've left some things out, but for example, well, we include in our analysis, which is basically my company's software augmented to include a lot of things like Medicare and Medicaid and food stamps. So we include everything on this list except for Obamacare, which we're going to add, and also city income taxes, like New York income taxes. But everything else we have, and generational skipping trust, we don't have that. So we have essentially everything else. We do have everything else. And incorporating all that stuff is a long process. And so it took about 3 years putting together what we call the Fiscal Analyzer, which is the company's software augmented to incorporate these other programs so that we could have a really truly comprehensive picture of marginal taxation, average taxation, and inequality measured in the form of spending inequality. Now, the analysis is decidedly life cycle and intertemporal because people just don't live for 1 year. We're all pretty good evidence of that proposition. So it doesn't really make a lot of sense to compare, when you're talking about progressivity, for example, the taxes that an 80-year-old is paying with those that a 30-year-old is paying, because the 80-year-old may have paid all his taxes in the past. And the 30-year-old may be having exactly the same income trajectory through time and resource trajectory and pay exactly the same taxes as the current 80-year-old. But if you look at the current 80-year-old, he might have a lot of income, or she might, because he or she saved a lot. So the income is high and the taxes could be zero, whereas the 30-year-old has low income and is paying positive taxes. It could look like a very regressive system, even though on a lifetime basis, they're going to be treated exactly the same if they have the same lifetime earnings path. So what we're doing in our analysis is to look at cohorts. We don't think that comparing apples and oranges makes any sense in this context, but that's the tradition of analysis down in Washington. If you look at the tax studies that are being done by the Tax Policy Center or the Tax Foundation or the Joint Committee on Taxation or the CBO, everything's being done where you're just comparing everybody regardless of age and as if they're going to live for one period. And it also permeates not just progressivity analysis and inequality analysis, but also work incentive analysis or disincentive analysis, marginal effective tax rates, because they're just considering what happens if I earn money now this year and I spend it all this year, as opposed to earning extra money now and saving some of it, in which case you're going to have to pay more taxes on that money that you earn this year. There's the issue of double taxation. And so, this study incorporates corporate income taxation, both federal and state corporate income taxes, because, that's partly being paid by, we're paying, when we save and we put our money in 401ks, we get a lower return because we have to pay corporate income taxes. The study is also very careful about dealing with full FICA taxation, so we're not treating employers as somehow paying the FICA, half of the FICA tax. That's just a charade to make somebody feel better, maybe workers. But so this is really, I think, the first really truly comprehensive analysis of our fiscal system. That's and what do we do with it? Well, with this machine that now has these different provisions, well, we can calculate both delta C over delta Y when we're talking about marginal taxation. So we can look at current year tax rates, but we can also look at what we call remaining lifetime net tax rates. So there's current year net tax rates and remaining lifetime net tax rates. Remaining lifetime net tax rate is, I give John an extra, let's say $1,000 this year, and he's going to, because he's a life cycle consumption guy, he's going to smooth his living standard. That's what the software does. It smooths John's living standard subject to borrowing constraints, so it doesn't let him go into debt, and it takes into account his household composition, it takes into account economies and shared living, it takes into account the relative cost of kids. We assume that kids are like 70% as expensive as parents, as adults. So it takes all that into account, and the idea is to smooth the living standard per household member so that when the household, if Jimmy leaves the household, then the living standard of Katie and John stays the same as it was before per each of them. So the lifetime marginal net tax rate is the extra present value. If I give John an extra $1,000, I'm the government, let's say, or he earns an extra $1,000, will he be able to spend in present value an extra $1,000? If he can only spend an extra $500 in present value, if that's what the delta PBC, that's the present value of his extra consumption, is only $500, then he's facing a 50% marginal effective remaining lifetime net tax rate. So this is important. It's important to also realize that people are having to make decisions about labor supply based on discrete amounts of additional earnings. If I earn this much, $15,000 more a year by working part-time at McDonald's, how much more will I pay in lifetime taxes for that? Well, that's not a kind of an infinitesimal change, so you really would not expect it all to be consumed today. People aren't going to be willing to just consume it all today. They're going to save some of it. And so this machine can handle those kinds of changes in earnings and figure out the marginal effective tax on these discrete changes in the present value of lifetime income of earnings. So So the key question that this software is focused on in our analysis is what will we get to spend smoothly over the rest of our life if we earn more. And again, this term smoothly is subject to this borrowing constraint. So for many American households, you can't have a perfectly smooth living standard. They can't have that because they're borrowing constrained. It could be that they're borrowing constrained many times over the lifetime, or it could be just that they're borrowing constrained between now and the time the kids get out of college and they've paid off or now in between the time the mortgage is paid off, and then maybe they're constrained at less constrained, so they've got a living standard here, and then it jumps up until the mortgage is paid off, and then it jumps up again, and maybe it even goes higher after Social Security comes in at 70 if they wait that long. So the software figures all this stuff out in literally a half a second. Now, taking into account all those provisions. Now, let me explain how this thing works so that it doesn't just sound like a big black box. And it's taken a lot of years. We started in '73 to try and build this, and it was kind of started with Alan and I doing work on trying to model adequacy of life insurance. So we needed to figure out how to program that up. And of course, we're using Fortran, and that's what this program is. It's all built in Fortran. And as far as I know, Fortran runs faster than C++ or any other program. These are as fast. So don't look down on that use of that software, but it would be too hard to convert it because the software now is like this thick in terms of if you're printing it out. But the key thing we had to worry about is too many state variables, because we're trying to solve a problem not just how to smooth your living standard when both the husband and wife are alive, but also how to smooth it when the husband dies and the wife's a single person, or the wife dies and the husband's a single person. So we had to figure out all these contingent survivor paths, and that produces a lot of state variables. It's basically the wealth, the regular assets, and the retirement accounts of either the couple or a single person in all the contingent survivor states in each year. That's a lot of state variables if you're going to try and do all this in one single dynamic program. So somehow I got the brainstorm to break this up into 3 programs that would talk to each other, that would pass data. So the way this thing works is we have one program that takes the life insurance premiums and the taxes that people are going to be paying as given. So you start out with guesses of these things. You then solve the consumption smoothing problem, and it's really perfect consumption smoothing. It's like Leontief preferences in living standard. So you want to have exactly the same living standard. The program allows you to modify that if you want to run it where the living standard has some different pattern. But for this study, we're keeping it perfectly smooth. Now, so once we've solved that problem, we have consumption functions for each period, and then we can go and ask, drive the start at time 0 with the initial conditions, use those consumption functions, which are just really guesses of the right functions, and figure out what living standard the household would have every year, and then go to the life insurance routine and figure out how much life insurance is needed for the surviving spouse, for each surviving spouse, if the surviving spouse dies in each year, if one of the spouses dies in each year, so that they can have that living standard that this first round produced. So now we have from that life insurance premiums, where we have an update of our guess of life insurance premiums. And then we also, in running the program forward, we can start calculating the taxes using the actual 1040 and state specific codes. So now we have new guesses of both the asset path and the premiums and the taxes. And then what we do is we shrink the grid, because this problem is one of certainty. It's a deterministic problem. We don't have we're not formally modeling uncertainty. This is not like Smetters and Nishimura, I got that right? Who have solved this life cycle problem with idiosyncratic earnings uncertainty, and that's a model that CBO, they used with the CBO when they were there, but that CBO is using now for some of its analysis. So there's no uncertainty, so it's really deterministic. So to get this thing to really be precise, you have to get around the approximation that comes with dynamic programming when you have, you can't have an infinite number of grid points, so you have to either end up with something that's an approximation to the right answer, or you shrink the grid each iteration until it's like this, and you get it exactly right to the dollar, to many decimal places actually. So that's the way our software works. We actually solve this thing exactly through shrinking the grid. And then you can test, you can look at the reports and see that the software is producing the right results, because whenever the living standard jumps up, when the household is borrowing constrained, the assets end up exactly at zero. So you wouldn't want to, hold any assets over if you're borrowing constrained. You die broke, you never go into debt, so your living standard is always smooth in periods where you're not borrowing constrained. So you can see just, by eyeing it, that the thing actually is delivering what it says it's supposed to be doing. So anyway, so you've got some sense of how this thing works. You have some sense of why current year analysis versus lifetime analysis, how they differ, and why lifetime analysis is, I think, more appropriate. We've been running to date the 2013 SCF data. We've kind of blown the data up to 2015 value, nominal amounts. So we're running the SCF, Survey of Consumer Finances, from the Federal Reserve through the program to analyze average and marginal effective remaining lifetime net tax rates, as well as current year tax rates, and also to look at inequality in lifetime spending. Now, this really is, I think, what economists ultimately think about when it comes to inequality. It's not wealth by itself. I know there's a lot of people who are focused on wealth inequality, Piketty and other people. Some people are just focused on income inequality. But John here could be the richest person on the planet. He could have $300 billion, let's say. And if I'm Uncle Sam and I grab all 300 billion of those and distribute it to everybody equally, John will not get to spend anything more than everybody else. Let's suppose I do that with everybody's resources, so I'm the perfect communist. And so you cannot understand inequality without understanding the fiscal system. And there's a big fiscal system we've got in our country and other countries too. So you have to look at inequality. You have to do it within, I think it only makes sense, we think, Al and I think it only makes sense to do it within a cohort. And so what we do is we look at, like, for example, 40-year-olds, we array them from top to bottom from terms of their remaining lifetime resources, which is their human wealth plus their net wealth. And we look at percentiles, like quintiles, or in the top 5%, the top 1%. We ask them what share of the cohort's total present value of spending do these different groups get to do. And I'll show you the results. And the inequality in the spending is a whole lot smaller than the inequality in wealth, because wealth is just one component going into spending. Another component is labor income, which is more evenly distributed than is wealth. And another component is transfer payments from the government, which are much more evenly distributed, or distributed unequally towards the poor. And then you've got taxes, which are distributed unequally towards the rich, to the high resource people. So all these factors add up to making wealth inequality much less significant spending inequality much less significant than wealth inequality. So I'll come to that. But the main purpose of today's talk is about incentives to keep working. And these are the median remaining lifetime and current year net tax rates facing 40-year-olds. And just to get a picture of those, they're all pretty high. They're higher for the top 1%. If you look at this column here, which is the lifetime number, that's a 50% median rate. So it means that more than half of the 40-year-old top 1% tiers are facing marginal tax rates above 50%. And but even for the lowest quintile, we're talking about 38%. You can see that there are some significant differences between current year and lifetime marginal tax rates. Here's what if you look at this and you look at this, you see the difference between the Republicans came out with a new tax plan today. A couple weeks ago, they had what's called the Unified Framework Plan. So we have analyzed the Unified Framework Plan. Today, we're analyzing the new tax plan, but I don't think it's going to be that much different than what you see here. So if we go back to this picture, this is current law. You see the top 1%, their marginal tax is 50.8%. Under the new law, if it gets passed, it'll be around 46%. So that's a change, but it's not enormous change in marginal incentives for or disincentives for working for the top 1%. What about the bottom? Well, their marginal tax rate is 26 under current law. The lowest quintile, 26.9%, goes up to 28.7%. So what we're seeing are some reductions in marginal tax rates. Sorry, that was it's actually an increase, right? No, sorry. That was it's an increase for the lowest folks, and it's a decrease for the top 1%. That's shows what it shows. That's whether you like, here's a picture of kind of dispersion of marginal tax rates under current law. This is again for the 40 to 49-year-olds, and this is under the new law. So old law, new law, it changes quite a bit. This is showing you the distribution of marginal tax rates. So we've got, this is, for example, 41 to 50%, 51 to, so we're plotting the share of the population in these different categories, and you can see that there are significant changes between the new and the old law for the 40-year-olds. What about if we move on to 60-year-olds? Well, actually, I want to make sure I didn't pass up on this. Oh, yes, I did. Okay. I told you about the 40-year-olds. I want to make sure you see the 50-year-olds. The 50-year-olds, actually, this is current law for the 50-year-olds. I want you to compare this number, 50.4 and 26.9, with that for, under current law, for 40-year-olds. You can see for the low earners, the low resource people, 40-year-olds are facing much higher marginal taxes than the 60-year-olds. The top 1% are facing pretty similar taxes. Let's think about the third quintile. 40-year-olds, it's 35%. Let's go to it's about 35%. So these marginal tax rates are not all that much different across these cohorts, interestingly enough. But they're still, quite high. And they'll still be pretty high under the reform, but not quite as high, especially, well, they'll be higher for the poorer people, but lower for the richer people. So you can make of that what you will. Now, here's the 60-year-olds, the dispersion under current law. Here's under the unified framework. So there's going to be a lot of differences in marginal taxes facing different people if this reform is passed. There's a lot of changes in this. This is like a 460-page bill, and it's got a lot of stuff in it, and it's going to make some differences. Now, let me tell you about progressivity. Here's 40-year-olds. The average lifetime tax rate for lifetime tax rate is actually, I gotta make sure, yeah. It's 34.43% for the top 1%. It's negative 58% for the lowest quintile. So they're getting a whole lot more in transfers than they're paying in taxes. So you have a picture here, if you look at these kind of orange bars of progressivity, if you look at the red bars, you have a picture of progressivity based on current year average taxes. We're talking about average net taxes divided by average income within the cohort. So the differences in assessing progressivity when you use lifetime analysis versus current year analysis is quite significant right here, especially at the lower end of the resource distribution. You know, you've got the second quintile, 4.3% versus 20%. I think it's time for us to be doing lifetime analysis as opposed to current year analysis, because it just doesn't make a lot of sense from an economics perspective. Now, the unified framework let's look at the top 1%. It's going to drop their tax rate from 34.3 down to 31.8. So they're going to have a pretty, a significant, not enormous, cut in their average tax rate. And then what about the poorest people? Well, they were negative 58%. Now they're going to be negative 53%. So that's a smaller negative number in absolute terms. So this is a policy that so far is redistributing from the poor to the rich. So it's not as progressive, but it's not wildly less progressive than the current system. Let me talk to you about the distribution of wealth. So for 40-year-olds under current law, they have, the top 1% have about 12% of the spending, that's this green bar, but they have 23% of the wealth. So the inequality in spending is very different from the inequality in wealth. And if you look at the lowest quintile, they do about 7% of the spending, but they only have 1.6% of the wealth. Under the unified framework, that 11.9 goes up to 12.1 for the top 1%. So their share goes up of the spending, and the share of the lowest quintile goes down from 6.6 to 6.3. Again, it's not hugely different, but it's something. Now, why did I get back there? Oh, somehow sorry. Okay, let's try that. Yeah, okay. Let's look at the inequality. Oh, geez, doesn't like me. All right, let me try and do this more slowly. I've got basically one more slide I want to talk to you about, and then I want to show you one other picture. I had a slide here for, yeah, okay, good idea. Okay, here's 60 to 69-year-olds under current law.
That's the one you want to?
Yeah, okay. But that's okay, I think they can see it. And then, yeah, we're good. And this, you can see that the distribution of marginal tax rates changes a lot. Before, after. So let me show you one of the craziest pictures you'll likely see as economists when it comes to our fiscal system. I got to go down here to page 68. This is in a paper that I wrote with Alan and Darrell called "Is Uncle Sam Inducing the Elderly to Retire?" And our conclusion is that he is. And this is a picture of the dispersion. In this particular paper, we assume that the adjustment that the earnings test is perceived to be a tax, and that people don't understand the adjustment of the reduction factor. Whereas in the results I was just showing you, we did assume we did implement the adjustment of the reduction factor. That's for some people, they're not going to know what I'm talking about, but it's all about Social Security lingo for whether the earnings test is actually going to matter to your lifetime benefits. And anyway, so if people, it's very complicated to understand it, so most people I don't think do understand it, and assuming they don't understand it, and the picture wouldn't be that much different even if we did assume they did understand it, you see this huge dispersion in marginal effective tax rates. We stopped the chart at 180%, but we have some people facing marginal tax rates above 5,000% because they earn an extra, more money. They're going to lose Medicaid, not just this year, but for the next 5 years for themselves and their kids. So this is how you can get such high marginal tax rates. I don't think this fits in with any optimal tax theorist's idea of what optimal taxation should be. So I would, if any of you folks are doing optimal tax analysis, take a look at this picture and ask yourself if your theory could actually connect to that picture. It's just, it's just the result of a lot of complicated programs that different committees in Congress have been passing, and you also have state governments that have their provisions, and they're all interacting to produce this this craziness. And just think about the excess burden, the inefficiency associated with having people at the same level of resources, and this is like 8 million in resources, having very different marginal tax rates. Why would we want that to be the case? So we have a pretty crazy fiscal system, and we have to look at it, I think, the right way, and then maybe if we can get people in Congress to look at these pictures, they will start producing things that are more rational. And I think that the tax bill that was introduced today does go somewhat in that direction, but it also introduces some pretty wacky things, as including a pretty significant tariff that's imposed just on foreign companies who are operating in the U.S., which is, so Trump got his tariff in through the back door on page, 68 of the House Ways and Means Committee doc that they issued today in some thing that's very hard to read and understand, but they've introduced a tariff, but not on U.S. companies who are importing, not on Walmart's, but on Mercedes-Benz. If they're importing parts from Germany, they're going to get hit with a 20% tariff on those parts. We have to keep up with these politicians because to understand what they're up to, because if we don't sweat the details, things will get even worse, perhaps. So that's what I have to say. And Alan, do you have anything to add? Okay, good. Okay. Good.
Okay, thanks. Kent Smetters is going to discuss.
Great.
Good. Thanks for inviting me to discuss. It's a neat paper. So many retirees, as the paper really points out, really depend greatly on Social Security. It's the biggest asset for over half of retirees. And then, basically, the premise of this paper is that, hey, they're poor, and then we kick them again with these really high marginal tax rates that often encourage them to retire or just not work. And really, the big contribution of the paper is that it's an amazing amount of work. Don't worry about dynamic programming and all that type of stuff. It's an amazing amount of calculations across all of these programs. Everything but Obamacare basically was in there. And that was, by the way, optimal timing, way to see where the politics, worked out on that and so forth. And so that was pretty smart. By the way, you're probably going to be able to keep the current tax code in there as well, but or if you do recode, it's from Ireland. But in any case, I think it accomplishes a lot. So I don't have a tremendous amount to say about critiquing the paper. It's more about additional questions for policy application. And the first one is, again, the premise of the paper is people are poor, and then we hit them with these really high marginal tax rates. in retirement. And so then the question is, of course, why are people seemingly so poor who are depending so highly on Social Security? And one view is that they're don't have a lot of wealth because Social Security itself discourages wealth accumulation. Large literature on that, Feldstein and zillions of others have basically said Social Security wealth itself discourages wealth accumulation. So in that sense, pay-as-you-go Social Security systems, or just Social Security in general, is in fact self-fulfilling. And CBO's rule is at $1 Social Security wealth reduces private saving by 50 cents. Large related literature that Larry's contributed to and recorded equivalents, it also suggests that people are in fact are not saving this type of wealth. It wasn't focused on Social Security, but basically Larry has found only about every dollar transfer to older people, maybe it's 13 cents that actually gets saved for the next generation. And then you can take it even more extreme of Buchanan's Samaritan's Dilemma problem, where people rationally undersave so they can get Social Security. I've never quite bought that argument. It's a coordination problem. But the other view is that people are, we have Social Security because people aren't rational, these beta delta preferences. And so, but even here, exactly what is the optimal policy design depends on how you actually model behavioral kind of non-standard geometric discounting stuff. So why does this all matter? Is that I don't buy this, but I'll throw it out there. One view is, suppose that you have a lot of rational people. Remember, the Social Security is very progressive. We have this 90% replacement rate, works its way down. And so whenever you have regressivity, you actually want to have more high marginal tax rates than those who receive stuff. This is the optimal tax literature. Essentially what you want to do is people who get a lot of stuff, you don't want people who are more productive to kind of pretend like they're those people. You want to make their lives kind of miserable. They face high marginal tax rates, and that allows you to satisfy the incentive compatibility with large amounts of redistribution. The second issue that we often think about in the case of annuities, like Social Security's risk reclassification, I don't think that's a big issue here because Social Security's return is tied already to a population average. You can't reclassify your own risk. I actually throw this out there as a theoretical possibility. I don't think this is that important, honestly, because this Social Security is more like a Vickery lifetime tax. It's not so much your simple Murley's optimal single period tax problem. And you pretty much have to be poor a long time in order to get this big redistribution. So I think my guess is that, no one's really worked this out. Current screening models are pretty simple, but nonetheless, my guess is it's probably not a big deal. We probably do want to have low marginal tax rates. You could also say, even if people are beta discount preferences, but they're sophisticated, if you have limited, direct mechanisms for punishing them for not saving enough in private saving, this may be an indirect mechanism to kind of punish them, that basically say ex ante, if you don't save, you think you can work your way out of it later on, but no, we're going to punish you for doing that. That is potentially one way you could get this too. My own guess in the end is Larry is definitely right. You can probably get away with high redistribution with probably pretty low marginal tax rates. And the last graph, which I think is the killer graph of that paper, is that there's almost nothing you can, 100% marginal tax rates aren't unreasonable if you're talking about extremely poor people and single period redistribution, but there's nothing that can kind of rationalize that graph. And so then what is the optimal consumption target? It's probably not smooth consumption in my opinion. In particular, new retirees, so financial planners go through this 3-step process with new retirees called needs, wants, wishes. Needs are kind of like your base floor consumption, keep you off the street, a roof over your head. Wants are kind of like, maybe visit your kids and grandkids, have money to do that. And wishes is like the Paris vacation, so you don't have to visit your kids or grandkids. And those are more kind of stretch goals and so forth. And it's typically for middle-aged retirees, they face a lot of out-of-pocket medical expenses, so there's a lot of more lumpiness that happens there than older retirees. I think that's where the state-dependent utility starts to kick in. It's not Paris vacations anymore. It really is downgrading to as well as along with skilled nursing. Nonetheless, what do we want as an optimal consumption target? Some people have argued in the past, including Marty Feldstein and others, is that maybe we don't want an old age system, we want an old age system. The idea is an increasing annuity in retirement, and that's especially important if you don't think private real annuities exist, which they basically don't. That could actually be efficient because precautionary saving is part, it's when you have these uncertainty, you save precautiously, but it's actually second best. First best is always insurance, if you could pool that risk. And so second best can actually having an increase in real annuity could actually be more efficient, unless they enhance borrowing constraints. But even then, it's likely that it only makes the case that you want lower marginal tax rates when you're older. And then the third issue is what is true and what is perceived. In particular, in the paper, they do a lot of calculations about what is true. And the fact that matters, as Larry pointed out, is an incredible amount of calculations. You're not able to do that yourself. True is really about trying to maintain a standard of living. So even if you have rational agents, and they're informed, but some are lucky, some are unlucky, you may actually want to have a good amount of redistribution to kind of help the unlucky ones. But the problem is that you have this big, complex, you take away some food stamps, take away some other stuff to try to fix that type of system on the true stuff, what really matters. So there's a positive cost to that, potentially doing that. But in fact, a lot of distortions in the current system are probably simply because of perception issues. Before retirement, for example, the average person in even a pay-as-you-go Social Security system, the average kind of beneficiary, if R is equal to G, which is probably true these days, it's not distorting because they get it's a perfect tax benefit linkage. Most people probably don't realize that. That's a complicated calculation. After retirement, the calculations Larry presented, they basically assume that people don't understand the benefit recomputation, and so the earnings test is kind of the big one. I actually have this radio show on Sirius XM, and I offer free financial advice. And so if you ever want to have something you want to plug, I've had Larry on 4 or 5 times talking about Social Security and his software there. And whenever this comes up, the earnings test, even the financial advisors, they only allow what's called fee-only advisors. These are the guys who are true fiduciaries and so forth, almost all CFPs and so forth. They don't even understand it. And in particular, they always say, well, there's this earnings test, and I always have to tell them there's actually this benefit recomputation that kind of is supposed to cancel this out. Most financial advisors don't even understand it. And so it's not so surprising the average Joe out there is not going to understand it. When it comes to perception problems, these could be actually freebies to fix. If you can somehow figure out how to have people understand the tax benefit linkages, they could even be negative cost to fix on a dynamic score basis, to drop in some tax language today. And that's because if in fact they improve labor supply decisions and so forth, they could actually be more than free to fix. So that seems like the low-lying fruit there. So what's the next steps here? I think it would be really interesting to simulate a lot of the perception issues. Models that I've built, Larry and Alan have built and so forth, typically they're assuming these forward-looking agents, they don't have perception issues, they understand tax benefit linkages and so forth. It'd be interesting to actually quote up some of that in general equilibrium. And of course, at the same time, recognizing that Social Security is one part of a larger optimal fiscal policy system. So in fact, when you actually have a broader tax system that does other things like builds roads, tanks, and so forth, you're in the world of kind of second best. In fact, I have this paper I never actually, some notes that I never polished it off at some point. And that is, you can actually show in some crazy weird things that you get out, like annuities. We all think annuities is a good thing. Actually, when you're in the second best world, you could actually show killing annuities is actually welfare improving. And the reason why is you actually want to stimulate your precautionary saving because that's what you want to tax. And so you can get these weird results. So you kind of want to do this in a general equilibrium, full environment. But my guess is that lower marginal tax rates are probably efficient, and there's probably some really free lunches that come from it. The earnings tax itself seems like that comes from a day of zero-sum economics, where basically the bargain was, we give old people a retirement, they get out of the workforce, make a job available for younger people. I don't see any reason why just don't get, just eliminate it. And I don't think it's going to cost practically anything to eliminate, probably negative costs. The tax benefit linkage, someone mentioned earlier, Social Security has tried to tackle this a little bit in the past, or at least they thought about it, that they basically found it hard to run computers that actually show people the tax benefit. If you work, you make another $1,000, here's how much your benefit goes up by. But nonetheless, I actually think this has a historic fluke to it as well. In particular, part of the goal of redistribution was to make it a lot less transparent. And because of the classic debate, including behind Cohen and Friedman, which I think you guys referenced in your book years ago, with Sil Schieber, whereas Cohen was the head of Health and Human Services that ran Social Security at one point. Milton Friedman wanted to figure out how to get rid of Social Security, and they had this big debate about redistribution, and Friedman basically said, let's just have simple redistribution, bottom layer, make it really simple. Let's be honest, this is a redistribution program, and everybody else says in their private accounts. And Wilbur Cohen said, any program that focuses on the poor will become a poor program, and basically saying we want to hide the redistribution. And I actually think that's part, politics and bad economics has been behind some of these distortions. And I think a lot of this could actually be easily eliminated and create a lot of efficiency.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. I think the whole issue of how transparent the system should be, I appreciate the Wilbur Cohen view of the world. I don't think some of these, like the earnings test and things like that, really relate to that. I mean, that has to do more with making it a universal program instead of a program just for the poor, as a way of hiding the within cohort redistribution. But I think the earnings test doesn't really serve any. It's definitely opaque, but I don't think it serves to, foster hidden redistribution. I think it just is confusing, and one could think of ways of reforming the system under the assumption that people respond only to current tax consequences, and it would sort of be interesting to think about. One of the things Larry and I have talked about is thinking about thinking about labor supply. You mentioned putting labor supply in, thinking about labor supply under a variety of assumptions about what people respond to, and seeing what kinds of reformed retirement systems or taxation of people around retirement age would sort of give the best most positive labor supply responses in terms of reducing distortions.
To the earnings test, I don't think that was the part of hiding redistribution. I think that was just coming from zero-sum economics. The part of it's the tax benefit linkage when you're working that I think is hard to calculate because of the redistribution aspect that I think is very opaque, and I think there was political reasons behind that, is my view.
But if you really thought you were fooling people,
We're doing a duet.
no, but if you really thought you were fooling people,
Yeah.
Then they wouldn't perceive. Then they would. I mean, the narrative is that there's perfect tax benefit linkage. You're making contributions. You're not paying taxes. So if you were really tricking people, you'd be tricking them into supplying labor in an undistorted way.
If they really thought that they were getting wait, if they thought they were getting a flat benefit.
But they're getting at least there's some people who think they're getting when they retire, they're getting a repayment of the contributions they made plus interest.
Yeah, I mean, I think it comes down to, do they think they're getting a flat replacement rate or a flat benefit? Yeah.
Okay, one question and then drinks, but and after the
Well,
question,
I'm
I have one.
surprised, John, that you didn't point out that these results are not very consistent at all with your own paper. Let's think about somebody who's adding on the margin of, instead of retiring at some age in their 60s, when they otherwise would, they add one more year of employment in which they earn $20,000. Now, do we really think that the marginal tax rate looks like what it looks like in this paper? Is that really a reasonable thing to think? Remember, the income tax on $20,000 a year isn't all that much. If it permits the person to get over the liquidity hoop that is forcing them to take a Social Security pension, then they're certainly adding to their future annual income just by the addition to Social Security benefits they get by postponing the collection of Social Security benefits. I think that that's a pretty compelling argument in favor of John's paper with his co-authors, as opposed to the estimate in this paper, which makes it seem like it's not, in terms of lifetime consumption, it's not having a very big effect at all.
It's a different set of assumptions. I mean, I think numerically they're both probably correct, and the question is whether, I think in Alan and Larry's paper, it's what if you earned some more money? And on our paper, it's what if you worked a little longer, which is a little different. And in our paper, it's also, when you do work a little longer, you postpone all forms of annuitization, both the annuitization of your 401k and your annuitization of Social Security, if you want to call it that. I just think they're two different calculations. We do get very different answers, I agree, but maybe when you look at the difference of the way the problem's set up.
Let me just respond a little bit. I think there's two different kind of issues. One is, what do we actually have, and is this really what our Congress wants? We have an obligation to explain to our Congress and President what they've done to us. But then the other thing is, as economists, I think we have a role in actually telling people what to do, because this stuff is just too complicated for anybody to figure out. So, and I think as a profession, we've been basically acting like doctors who just do research and don't treat patients at all. They say, well, leave that to the chiropractors. But I think that increasingly we have, as a profession, we need to be figuring out ways like, and your paper connects to this, John, ways to actually help people through this morass and improve their living standard. And if it comes to, if you just earn more but you take Social Security early, you're not going to be better off, you'll be worse off. But if you do this and this and this, you'll be better off. Then we need to, to do that, show them that.
Usually we do this at the second day, but I'd like to do it today. And namely, if you think this conference is good, it's because of Celia Clark and Ben Murphy, but Celia in particular.